Hello, everyone.
Hi, Doris.
Hello. I am Doris Tellado. I work as a parent resource specialist for the University of Florida, North Central Early Steps. I'm also a board member of the Family Partners for the Deafblind of Florida and Virgin Islands. It's an affiliate of the National Family Association for the Deafblind. And just a shameless plug, we want to invite you to visit our social group in the Huba app and help us grow our network. We want to meet new friends. So as a parent in my journey, I'm a parent of a child who has complex medical care needs. I had experienced many instances of profound sorrow and grief. The trigger for this grief sometimes happened during a doctor's visit, other times while in the hospital, but many times the realization that life was not going to be what we had expected came to me in the most routine of moments. I wish I had been more aware of what I was going through and better equipped to recognize the supports and resources my family and I needed to navigate this grieving process. The following presentation will help us to identify the types of grief and the impact they can have on families, strategies for how to support families and truly meet them where they are, and it will give us a parent's perspective about the evolution of her grief across her son's life. Our three lead presenters are a team, a wonderful team of family engagement experts. Our presenters are Ms. Molly Black. Molly is a longtime family engagement consultant with the Pennsylvania Deafblind Project. In this position, she connects families and individuals to information and resources on deafblindness with an additional focus on secondary transition and grief. She and her husband reside in the Pittsburgh area in Pennsylvania. They have raised two grown daughters and one son who lived 22 years with Cornelia de Lange syndrome, the cause of his deafblindness. She serves on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Partnership for the Deafblind, the first state affiliate of the National Family Association of the Deafblind. Ms. Megan Cote is another presenter today, and Ms. Megan Cote has worked as the Family Engagement Initiative lead at the National Center on Deafblindness since 2015. In her more than 25 years in the field of special education, she has worked as a classroom teacher, coordinated multiple state-level grants, taught graduated coursework at the University of Kansas, and directed the Kansas Deafblind Project. And our last presenter is Ms. Jana Villemez. Jana has a master's degree and is a licensed professional in clinical social work. She brings with her past experience in geriatric behavioral health, children's palliative care, and hospice care. She has provided leadership and trainings for over 25 years for a national and international program that provides one-on-one caring for hurting individuals, which centers around grief and loss. Jana also has an older and courageous sister who brought into the world a beautiful niece, now 35 years old, with developmental disabilities. For the past 11 years, Jana has been honored to work as the Family Engagement Coordinator for a CAYSI Arkansas Deafblind Program.
Okay, so hello, everybody. Thank you for that warm welcome. My name is Megan Cote, and as was just mentioned, I'm the Family Engagement Initiative Lead at the National Center on Deafblindness. I'm thrilled to be with you today and frankly humbled by the invitation to speak to you about grief, a topic that my colleagues Jana Villemez and Molly Black and I believe is a real challenge for many families who are raising children with complex needs. Before we begin, I want to provide you with a quick disclaimer. Neither Molly nor myself are licensed counselors or psychologists. We're both mothers who have sons who both died and found ourselves with a sense of urgency to do more for the families we support around child loss. But Jana is a licensed social worker who can bring the clinical perspective to what we plan to share with you today. To start, we'd like to thank the families who have helped to build the training and the supportive community that embody this work. They have taught us so much, and we're eternally grateful to them for their honesty, bravery, and desire to live forward. We'd also like to thank Angela and the Florida Family Leadership Network for the invitation to be with you all today. We know that this is a sensitive topic and not one that's easy to discuss, so we thank you for your willingness to join, listen, and share. On our agenda for today is I will be providing a brief summary about our work thus far in the Deafblind Network around grief, so you have context for what we've been up to and what our work has taught us. Then Molly plans to share her story around raising her son and how her grief has evolved across time. And after that, Jana will share the clinical side of the potential impact grief can have on families. And then after the three of us are done, we'll be dividing you up into breakout rooms to have guided discussion around how the information we share and your lived experience informs your thinking about your practice and the support that you provide to families. So buckle your seatbelt, and here we go. Here's what the National Deafblind Child Count data tells us. From 2010 to 2018, an average of 89 children ages birth to 21 died annually. And in 2019, an average of 112 died. And then when we break down the data further, from 2010 to 2018, an average of 9 of those kids who died were in Part C and 80 were in Part B. And in 2019, there were 18 kids reported in Part C and 94 in Part B. Therefore, we're seeing an increase in the number of children who are being reported as having died and a significant increase in kids at a younger age. So back in 2017, we created a focus group comprised of 6 parents whose kids had died and asked them what they would like to see get created to support families in their loss. And the following needs were identified. 1, a list of resources for where they could go for support. 2, a connection to other families of children and young adults with deafblindness who had died. And 3, permission to know that what they learned from raising and loving their child still mattered and could help others. So we rolled up our sleeves and we got to work doing the following. We collected a list of resources to help parents connect to local and national information, whether it be resources that they could read or groups that they could join and go to virtually or in person. We trained a group of family members around peer-to-peer grief support. A 10-session curriculum was created. And then in 2017, we launched the first ever virtual peer-to-peer grief support program for family members of individuals with deafblindness. Now we have 2 groups, a level 1 group that starts each fall, and then a level 2 group, or as we call it, our maintenance group, which is comprised of families who have completed the first level and want to stay connected to one another because they've bonded and formed authentic friendships. And we have a closed Facebook group for our families who want to join that have taken part in our groups so that they can connect informally between our meetings and celebrate their recovery and their grief journeys together. So how might this grief group be unique? The families with whom we work are intimate caregivers of their children. And when they die, they report feeling their loss of their role and identity. They experience secondary losses, particularly the community of providers that surrounded them and the development and care of their child. They report that they are surprised by the reaction of their loved ones and community, how shocked they were by the death of their child, even though they knew how fragile they were. And finally, they share their concerns about how to best support the surviving siblings through their grief. So there's been very little research done in this area around the loss for families of children with complex healthcare needs. But in 2019, Dr. Jenny Stepanek published her dissertation called "The Experiences and Needs of Parents Whose Children Died due to a degenerative disability of qualitative analysis. She interviewed 7 bereaved parents whose children died between the ages of 3 to 21 due to complex healthcare needs. And I'm going to very briefly share with you some of the takeaways from her study. The themes of parent experience were abundant stress from dissonance, exhaustion, chronic changes, unanticipated shock, profound grief, ongoing struggles for validation, and the positive impact of formal and informal supports. The themes of need were hope, information, useful resources, helpful networks, healthy partnerships, choices, and validation. And the themes of parent preferred support during the loss and bereavement included professionals' awareness of and attention to parent experiences and needs throughout the child's lifespan, ongoing connections with providers and activities that were part of the child's life, and support options beyond the traditional bereavement groups. So as you can see, there are clearly parallels between what our deafblind families told us they needed during our initial focus group and what Dr. Stepanik's research reported. I have a quote here that I'd like to read to you that one of our grief group participants shared with us. She said, "I didn't know on the day my child died that I would miss cleaning syringes, cleaning up your puke, changing diapers, going to hundreds of appointments, seeing all those doctors and nurses at the hospital. It's like I had this family of medical people, and then they disappeared when you were gone. I'm feeling emptiness." What Molly, Jana, and I have come to understand and believe is that for many families, grief begins the minute you realize your child has a disability and ebbs and flows across the lifespan. This doesn't mean that these families don't love their child and find joy in raising them. They most definitely do. It just simply means that the reality that they thought they would have may be different than what they had envisioned. So now I have the honor of passing the torch to Molly, who's going to be sharing her journey in raising her son to give you one parent's perspective on loss.
So, as established, I am not an expert on the topic of grief across the lifespan. I can only speak to my own experiences, and having had the pleasure of attending Marisol's presentation earlier, you may find some common themes. We all have a set of coping skills developed through our own unique understandings. Given the opportunity to process the 22 years that my son lived and the 8 years since he died, I've given a lot of thought to my emotions, my health, my circle of support, and finally, my own behavior. I think it is important to share that I had a brother with a disability, and I watched my parents cope over the years to care for him as his health deteriorated and he died at the age of 49. I never really identified, though, as a sibling of a person with a disability while growing up, which I find odd in myself now as I look back. I believe it was because his disability, while chronic, was gradual, and there was very little disruption to my own life. I did observe the incredible worry in my parents' eyes as their concern grew over his long-term care if he outlived them. I think I learned a lot of incidental lessons about caregiving that proved helpful in my own circumstances. My parents are now deceased, but I have to tell you, I can't tell you how many times I've wished that I could talk to them now about how very similar our lives have played out. When our son Alex was born, I did feel like that the rug had been pulled out from underneath me. But my husband and I dug right in, regardless of the unknown. In 1991, there were no Google searches, and long distance calling was very expensive. We depended on specialists at our children's hospital and the foundation attached to our son's etiology of Cornelia de Lange syndrome, or CDLS, for the guidance that we needed. We set out to get the best information to make good decisions, because the first years were most definitely the medical years. Over time, experience gave us expertise in our son's care. However, in the beginning and many times after, I often felt watched and overseen by the professionals in which we crossed paths. Often approvingly, and other times not so much. But in the NICU, I will say that was the first time I ever had any interaction with a social worker in my life. And I was very aware that what I said and how I responded would be judged. Alex faced many surgeries and procedures. The most pressing was open heart surgery as an infant, and it was repaired again a second time when he was older. And I will be honest that not until that surgery was completed did I really feel confident in a future with our son. I even remember expressing that to the outreach director of our school for the deaf, who had just come with me to a routine audiology appointment. To still remember that moment must be really significant in my acceptance of the long-term caregiving that I had come to terms with. Not that I had to come to an acceptance of the caregiver role, but rather that our son was going to survive. He was already loved, but I look back at it as trying to protect my heart, and I think I could now invest. During these early years, my life abruptly changed. I found myself quitting my job, becoming a one-income household, and a stay-at-home mom. Positively, though, it gave me opportunities. I was able to be with my children full-time, and I went back to school in the evening and was able to attend all of his therapies and doctor's appointments. Although the schedule was busier than before, meeting the needs of each family member was doable, myself included. The ability to finish my college degree was just for me. And I would encourage all caregivers to find something that is a healthy way to meet personal needs or goals if possible. I overheard a conversation recently where someone noted that there's joy in the challenges. And I don't think that I could describe my life any better than that. I was learning that what was is no longer, but what is could still be a rich life. The challenges were and the losses are so great. However, the joy that my son brought to our lives is profound. Selfishly, during this time, I began to volunteer with the CDLS Foundation so that I might learn of any new children or existing children in our state with CDLS. I would then be their first family contact after diagnosis. In retrospect, I learned that sharing information and resources is a great way to help settle oneself into a role that is placed upon you, not one you have chosen. I found hope in the midst of the relationships I was forming. I would encourage providers to lift your families into sharing roles. They are a wealth of knowledge as they have learned so much on their medical journeys. For me, there was restoration in helping. As a parent now supporting other parents, it soon became clear to me that we all have different learning styles, coping skills, and may not expect or even want the same level of communication. And that does not make any parent right or wrong in their approach to accepting their situation or the grieving or the processing that may take a day, a year, or even forever to resolve. To top it all off, we also added another baby into the mix, which brought its own additional joys and stressors. What followed in the educational years was incredibly stressful. Supporting a student with deafblindness and complex healthcare needs is difficult, and my level of expectation in the classroom was significant and important to his well-being. There was a 2-year period where we were in full due process with our school district. We really can't measure the level of stress that families go under and under what circumstances they are trying to function. I won't even pretend that I didn't at times feel a sense of chaos and discord, because I did. Once we were able to collaborate and compromise with the school district, the situation improved, but it was never ideal. Each school year brought with it great effort on our part to continue the sometimes tense relationships with the many administrators, related supports, and teachers that were involved. Moreover, that feeling of being judged was prevalent throughout Alex's schooling. Despite our best efforts, it often felt that it was us against the many providers of services rather than us with them, which was always our goal. The long-term sadness for me settled around the secondary losses, like the lack of true friendships for our son and the many milestones missed. I fretted over his quality of life because Alex endured a lot of pain in his body and exhibited many behavioral responses to the frustration over communicating his wants and his needs. Most of our worry was over what would happen if our son outlived us. Probably my biggest regret is not living in the moment or playing more with him when he was little or engaging more with him as he grew. I spent a lot of time planning for the next health issue or life transition or legal and financial supports beyond our own deaths. There always seemed to be something important that needed addressed, but looking back, nothing was more important than time with him. My husband and I trudged forward, sometimes stepping outside of our comfort zones, forced to be assertive with providers, doctors, or teachers when there was a difference of opinion. I like to work with people who have the ability to think outside the box. Teaming for problem solving goes a long way and can make a difference in the support and grace we give each other. Just as important is being kind to oneself and giving ourselves the same grace we give others. The balance that I sought came from understanding the vision for a good life for our son and what we came to picture as we explored our family value system. I really did have wonderful opportunities afforded me because of our son's disability. I became that parent that was asked to be on many a task force and many family engagement trainings, but that helped me learn about disability history, special education laws, and medical and educational entitlements. This moved me along to a paid position as a family engagement consultant with the Pennsylvania Deafblind Project. Parents are the true case managers of the supports and services that their children do or do not get while maneuvering through the many systems. Networking was my business when it came to my son, and it carried over to my other children. Learning to work with others, understanding the restrictions that professionals may be under, only helped to make the journey more understandable, and then the expectation of problem solving a possibility. So for me, taking on a professional position in the disability system was a coping mechanism, and it helped to push my own agenda forward related to the supports that I was seeking for my son. It connected me to the people that could make things happen for him. It gave me the education I needed to talk the language, be a partner at the table, and garner the respect that every parent deserves. Taking on this role raised my confidence in my own decision-making. It feels good to share information and resources with other parents in the hopes of making a difference and paying it forward. In turn, it brought with it a community. There's relief and peace of mind when one belongs. I've always said to new parents, you don't have to know everything. You just need to know where to find the answers, and that comes with connecting. This is not to say that there were not many dark days in raising our son. There was a life before the birth of Alex and a life after, and they looked very different. There were moments when I thought, I don't know how to raise this child without the involvement of so many other people. While I might have asked my mother or a friend about my typical daughter's needs as I raised them, I really could have been left to my own devices if necessary. But for our son, that just wasn't the case, whether dealing with medical or educational issues. I felt like I lived in two different worlds. I had my disability friends and I had my other friends. My social calendar depended on whether there was coverage, because you can't just employ the next door teenager to babysit. The responsibility was too great. And to this day, we do not live near family, so natural supports did not exist. Paid and trained supports were always necessary. However, as our daughters matured, they became capable and did take on responsibility that most siblings do not. To this day, I often worry about unnecessary expectations that they felt. They assure me often that they do not have any resentment, but as a parent of all my children, guilty feelings, whether warranted or not, remain. And then the unthinkable. Our son died, and what had always been possible happened, and it shook me to the core. You see, I learned through Jenny Stepanik's work that Megan mentioned that we often think of our vulnerable children as resilient. They had gone to the brink before and had survived. It didn't seem real for the longest time after that he was really gone. What I miss most is touching my son. I touched him every day. The caregiving was intimate. I was needed at a high level for as long as he was alive. We can't say that for our other typical children. They needed me, but their dependency faded as they matured. My caregiver role was suddenly whisked away in a moment. And as you heard in the quote that Megan shared, who knew we'd miss the messiness of caregiving, the endless medical appointments, the people who came through the revolving front door. The most important word that I have heard over and over again is validation. While processing my own grief and learning how others have grieved, is that while we all do grieve differently, we have validated for each other the many reactions and emotions that are so very similar in this unique group. And that has helped me most. It helped me to not feel so illogical at times. And I could hear others express what I was feeling. For a very long time, I experienced what I can only describe as extreme sadness. Through my work, I know how privileged I am that I did not have to experience the secondary loss of losing the disability community. Yes, we lost the therapists and the doctors, but I am still connected to families and the Deafblind Network through my work. I have been grieving my son's death with colleagues who are dear friends and have great empathy for my loss. Although for some, I represent their worst fear. They have been gracious and generous in their understanding, and for that I realize how incredibly fortunate I am. I never began any formal grief counseling until almost 3 years after my son died. I thought I was doing very well, and for the most part I was. But when I approached my grief in a formal way, it bubbled up, and I knew that I had never really processed it thoroughly and realized now that it was just under the surface. Because I kept it close, I experienced many physiological symptoms. I could drive down the road and forget where I was going or pass up the place I was to pull into. I purposely stayed up into the early hours of the morning so that when I finally laid down to sleep, my mind wouldn't wander to the last moments of my son's death and replay in my head. The lump in my throat would start just about 3:30 every day when he should have been coming home from his day in the community. And I felt that I was often wearing a mask with a fake smile. About the time I began to participate in a grief program at a local church, and then quite naturally joined an informal group of women in my area who have all lost children, did I then begin to feel like myself again. Not long after, Megan and 5 other women, myself included, began to plan for the Sensing Connections Grief Support Group through the National Center on Deafblindness. Our family continued to fundraise through city-sponsored runs for the CDLS Foundation. I was asked to sit on a couple of boards to further disability awareness and advocacy. All of these have provided purpose and meaning. I know now that what I experienced was traumatic to my mind, my body, and my soul. And I'd be remiss if I didn't admit that my faith is imperative in my living forward. I have leaned heavily on my faith and its promises. As a family, we continue to talk about Alex's antics, and just the other day had a family group text going on whether any of us believed that he would have kept a mask on during this pandemic. And it was a resounding no, with animated images, and that brought lots of smile and laughter. Life has marched on. Both our daughters are now married, Our oldest daughter is a market research analyst for a healthcare company. And that baby that was added to the family is now a speech language pathologist. They were both quite influenced by their brother. We, his family, are his legacy, and this opportunity to share him with you has meant so much to keeping him present and his life an example of our great losses and the strength of love, the depths of our sorrow, and the heights of joy found in the challenges. But mostly what remains over time is the love and the joy. Thank you. And I will pass it now off to Jana.
So, a heartfelt thank you for Molly's courage to tell her story of Alex, and us getting to see the joy and celebration amidst the pain. It depicts a journey through grief that was embraced wholeheartedly by Molly and her family. And while the grief is always there, the meaning they have made from it continues on. So thank you again, Molly. In the context Megan and Molly have shared on grief, I know it can evoke a myriad of emotions, thoughts and feelings from each of us, depending on our culture, how we grew up, our unique relationships, and our individual vulnerabilities and strengths. This is essentially a part of our unique worldview of what we assume life will be like. And then it doesn't happen. That expected reality that Marisol spoke so wonderfully of earlier today. And we are continually reminded of it as we navigate the change in our life into a new world that we're unfamiliar with, and are challenged to find others who are familiar with it and who are in a safe place to talk about it. I would imagine some of you have also embraced the process of grief and what has been so thoughtfully and painfully at times shared today. I would also hope you all in the space that you're currently in, I am included in that, would feel safe enough to feel the emotions you have or have had in the past. And when ready, move to where you are today at this conference and in the present. Next slide, Molly. Oh no, you've got it. I think we can all agree that losing a child is a grief that creates more pain and gut-wrenching questions about the order of life that is excruciating for those that have had to live with it. But for my purposes, I'd like to step back and work from this definition of grief: the conflicting feelings caused by the end of a change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So it's a loss of any kind, unique to the individual that's experiencing it. And the greater the loss to the individual, the more painful the grief journey can be. Acknowledging and processing the grief is key. One can't ignore it. It happens, it's there. But how it happens varies with each individual. The loss is not necessarily due to death, but nonetheless, it is a loss. Our families with children with complex healthcare needs have compounding losses. It could begin with diagnosis, but the complexity of living in the society we do and the systems that were created many times by those that may not have had any lived experiences of having a child with complex needs creates hardships for the whole family, compounding the loss, and again, having conflicting feelings caused by change in what is familiar. Next slide. This journey of grief is impossible to refuse, but it can lead to very different paths for families. Like any crisis, grief can be an up and down journey toward meaning making if we acknowledge the grief. And the people around us, our support systems, receive that acknowledgement from those of us who are hurting and view it as a normal part of grieving, which is what we have to go through in order to come out of it with new meaning and purpose. And we'll be explaining that more in the remaining time that we have today. I wanted to share a visual that I'm breaking into parts to explain to you. The visual helps guide me as I work with families. My work as a family engagement coordinator is to engage families, very similar to many of the roles that you serve, to be informed so that the families can be informed about the world of deafblindness, its impact on how their child learns, and how they can best advocate for their child and effectively lead their family. And in this visual, the family is indicated by a triangle in the center, the concept of providing a family-centered approach. And this triangle takes into consideration all members of the family, knowing that if a change happens to one member of the family, it impacts all family members. So there are also 3 circles that overlay the triangle and intersect with each other that indicates the family's level of possible engagement that I use, types of resources and opportunities to provide for them. These 3 overlapping circles indicate a family's capacity to be engaged at either an individual level, at a community level, and at a state or national level. So in its simplicity, most agencies and those supporting families might leave it at that. But if we take a deeper look at who each family is and what it takes to be ready to learn and engage at these levels, being family-centered is complex. For the family to be in a place of being able to be motivated to learn, seek our resources and be engaged, it's important for us to work with the families, to also be reminded of the support systems that surround them. Thinking about what it takes to successfully navigate these systems and knowing the stronger the supports, the stronger the family. You can see circling around the family in their ability to be engaged in our deafblind program, the ongoing critical systems that supports the family. That being the legal system, the financial system, the social network, the medical system, and the educational system. These systems of support are part of all families, but with our families, the diverse and complex level of knowledge and expertise to successfully interact with them is heightened significantly and compounds the stress, which can be secondary losses the family suffers as they lead their family. I think of the often unspoken financial changes in most families. I think of our educational system and the medical systems, while well-meaning, assess the child based on what they cannot do and where they should be compared to others. Again, more triggers of loss for the family. And in their isolation from being in the norm. I want to highlight the social networking surrounding families, and this was talked about from Molly as well. This provides us, this social network, with the needed support outside the formal agencies and really is critical. Yet in our families' lives, in so many of those relationships, those important key relationships, our extended family, friends, church family, so often they can dwindle or certainly change, which sadly is another loss. And included in the social network is each family's cultural beliefs and spiritual beliefs. All of these play an important part. As I engage with the family, I'm thinking about these systems that in many ways control the direction that the parent can or cannot go. I think about how that particular family is tackling these systems and their capacity to do so. Plus, you add to this the impact of the more vulnerable populations, the cultural and linguistic diversity of the family, and the challenge of access to these systems. Pretty complex, right? I am also taking into account where the families are in that circle around those major critical systems, which is the adult life stages of the parents. And as you can see in that circle, the up and down arrows in the life stages indicate what they indicate. And that serves as a reminder to me of the ongoing and or intermittent grief our parents have as they move through the child's and the parent's life. The adult life stages depict our growth and development, just like there are developmental stages of a child. Lived experience moves us in general patterns of maturity. As Molly so eloquently and courageously explained her journey of grief, she found new ways of coping. But as time went on, she continued to have losses that she had to find new meaning and purpose by leaning into this new world of connecting with others and being around supporting like-minded parents. And here's what I like to focus on, going back to our definition of what grief is: the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. The grief is lifelong, with the associated losses that come with it. On this journey, the good part is that the growth that comes from that process in the majority of families brings great joy in varying degrees with the family, depending on those life experiences and who they have connected with, felt supported, inspired by, and learned from others in the support systems. I ask you to keep thinking about the ongoing changes in the family's lives who have a child with complex needs. This may have began at birth in not having the child that they had anticipated, and yet they grew to realize or reframe their life now, having more meaning and purpose than they could have ever imagined by having their amazing child. The grief journey varies between individuals, and throughout the lifespan will fluctuate. Once again, the loss, the associated losses experienced, the journey and the process of how one grieves depends on the individual parent and family. Molly is quick to point out that her story is not everyone's story. She benefited from strong supports that other families do not have. But the grief part and associated feelings of shock, guilt, shame, isolation, and indescribable pain is universal and normal. Yet how this looks will be different for each family. This too can be complicated. Our grief experts have also helped us understand that we may process our grief differently. There is no right way to go through grief. How one responds has been put into categories that may help us not to judge how one is grieving. One may be more of what is referred to as instrumental grief, where you may be the person that shows that strong affective reactions, where one has powerful emotions that's expressed through sharing one's feelings, more like the person that's an open book. And then the other is that of intuitive grief, where you or your spouse may show more thinking than feeling, an inward quiet process with less expression of emotion. And outwardly, you may see coping as being more physical, expressing grief by doing something. For example, the thinking, I couldn't fix my son, but I can fix this broken fence. Or I can work with legislators to change the laws. We very frequently use Kubler-Ross's work in the stages of grief, with additional work with her and David Kessler that I don't want to minimize at all. It has helped in so many families and so many other individuals that are grieving. But I wanted to focus on another development in acknowledging grief called dual process model by Stobie and Shute. And this serves as a guiding reference in understanding the parents grieving. It's been demonstrated to be helpful for parents whose child has a disability. The research comes from Cantwell Bardo in that in our family's cases, so often there is that continual movement between the stress and coping processes. So families are going between loss-oriented, which is concentration on and coping with the stress of the loss, including the grief-related feelings and behaviors that we're familiar with, but also fluctuating to the restorative-oriented coping process, coping with the loss in efforts to adjust to changed circumstances, new roles, and new challenges. Throughout a family's life, the dual process model occurs. And when you think of those first years of a child's birth, the new parents that have little or no time for grief or rehospitalizations, it goes unprocessed and bypassed, and they are concentrating more on that restoration-oriented coping. Think of the systems picture that I showed you earlier and the family doing their best to navigate those critical systems. Triggers of their loss come up and our parents go back to grief as if it was just yesterday in the loss-oriented coping process. And yes, it gets messy, has been reiterated many times, but we need to factor in the trauma and stress when working with the families. The crisis that they experience in having a child with complex needs isn't a single event in having a starting point and an ending point. There's cumulative loss and trauma that typically exist, and we can see it in that heightened anxiety of our families in many cases. Naming the grief. This really does help us process it. I'm not suggesting you start your relationship with your families by getting them to talk about their grief. Rather, empathetically supporting the families where they are, listening and allowing them to share their history of their child, letting them tell their story and acknowledging that grief that you may hear or see in their behavior by validating their feelings and story in a very non-judgmental approach. Think of yourself and or the families that you serve as I go over the types of grief that all of or one or two types may apply. Anticipatory grief. This is grieving not for just what has already happened, but what is likely to happen or not happen in the future. You may experience strong anxiety over what will happen to their child, a parent might, after they die or no longer able to care for them. There's complicated grief, loss that is unanticipated, traumatic, and just wasn't supposed to happen. One can't make sense out of it, and the grief has no resolution. And given that society doesn't know how to support others in their grief, it's suppressed for fear of being judged and is less likely to seek help for fear of being further stigmatized. Ambiguous grief, when the losses are uncertain. Parents who have a child with complex needs or having a loved one who is present but psychologically altered or absent. This may cause feelings of being overwhelmed, exhausted, and confused by the lack of uncertainty. Enjoying the relief of not being in crisis mode and then back to another crisis that sets one back. One may experience a heightened level of anxiety awaiting the next episode, unable to enjoy the moments. There may be feelings that fluctuate between confusion, anger, and disappointment, and it just causes a roller coaster of emotions that are really difficult to manage. And then disenfranchised grief. Kenneth Doka, a researcher and therapist himself on grief and loss, defines it as losses that are not recognized nor understood by society, the world at large, the community, the social network of church, extended family, friends, cultural beliefs and values. And since society doesn't recognize it, it's also conflicting for our families to identify with grief as well, which further complicates grief. Consequently, if society doesn't know how to acknowledge it, there is little, if any, practical and emotional assistance. I'll tell you that Molly, Megan, and I have talked about this at length, and truthfully, we are included in this as well, in our hesitancy to share a presentation like this, simply because we're not immune to what society has taught us. It's uncomfortable and it's personal. Yet we know the conversation needs to happen in order to acknowledge its existence, for all to come out of it more whole, especially since we want the families to be able to successfully engage with us. And most importantly, so that in the end, they are stronger, healthier, and able to better care for their family and their child. So what does grief and journey of grief look like in our families? I caution you that because of the trauma and stress our parents go through, these same signs are prevalent. Just be cognizant that both the trauma and stress and the grief matter, but not all signs are grief related. Physical signs of grief can show shortness of breath, tightness in the throat and chest, changes in eating patterns, changes in sleep patterns, tiredness and fatigue, lack of energy, vulnerability to illness. These signs may also be intermittent, the emotional signs of loneliness and isolation, feelings of confusion, deep ongoing sadness, feelings of anger and rage, and resentment towards others. As individuals who work with families in some capacity, what can you do with this information that we have presented in talking about grief that our families experience? For the physical and emotional signs, which may show up intermittently, take time, watch for them, be curious and open with the family. And with a trusting relationship, which is key, affirm the family in their strengths, validating their feelings and what they can acknowledge. You can't fix it. I'll say that again. You can't fix it, but you can be open to listening and taking time. Also keep in mind the resilience of that our families have. While they're living with grief over all that we have talked about today, the fact is our families bounce back and keep marching in that same restorative part of grief that we talked about, where there's ability to cope with the fluctuating trauma and loss, the back and forth from orienting themselves as needed from the loss and what it means to being restored in the gift of their child and what that child brings and how they're making meaning and purpose for themselves and for others in the community. And they're leading their families in that same meaningful way. While I don't want each participant in this presentation, actually, I don't know each participant in this presentation. We are not immune to loss and pain. What helped you rewrite that narrative to bring meaning and purpose to you and to others? If you were to track what you did that helped rewrite your pain and your meaning for what you did, think about who supported you in doing so. And we need to think about that because that same holds true of our families. We want the majority of our families connected with other families in a safe place to tell their story without judgment, to process where they have been, where they are now, and what their vision is for the future. It is powerful. Their story is powerful. And reframing one's story in this way makes it more livable, still true, but more livable, moving to make meaning and purpose. I love Molly's story. She is not free from her grief, but she can openly and bravely tell you that she finds new meaning and purpose. She was able to reframe, rewrite her story to live more fully. And in her case, and in this moment of time, she continues to find such gratitude and healing in others in their journey. I want to add that the hard work of leading one's family in a world that assumes life is like the majority of families without a child with special needs conditions one to step back and stay in isolation. But once a family is connected with other families who can feel safe to share their life and their story, good things happen. Through this sharing, families are retelling their stories in a way that's more livable, so their grief becomes acknowledged in a way that allows them to find specific meaning and purpose in their life. And I would be remiss if I didn't add the last bullet of the concept of mindful self-compassion. The need for families to stop, breathe, and be in the present moment for themselves and their family, caring for themselves like they care for their families and others around them that are hurting. So while the majority of our families show astounding resilience, the question is, at what cost to their own health? Self-care and our own worthiness is a journey as well, but important to the concept of living a longer, higher quality of life for themselves and their family. We hope we have added some depth and understanding about the issue of grief for our families with complex needs. Our goal is to increase your awareness and understanding that loss plays a role in how our families are able to engage with you and others. And having this understanding will positively change the framework that you use to engage and respond to families. Like all of us who have experienced grief, we really do want to trust who we work with, feel we are on an equal playing field in our partnership in making change for our children, and to be heard and understood. In your role, here's what we would like you to take away. Please make no assumptions about another person's grief and loss. We caution you to know that not all behavior is grief. Be present and listen with empathetic care, especially to parents' experiences and their needs throughout their child's lifespan. Ensure a non-judgmental, trusting, confidential relationship. It's a tough topic with varied thoughts, feelings, experiences, as we have talked about. We have to get comfortable with uncomfortableness of grief, loss, and trauma. Start where the family is in their journey. Truly lean in and listen. Families want to be informed and understand their options. Please think of what we say we do, that family-centered approach. Offer what families have said they need, which again, Jen Stepanik's work that both Megan and Molly spoke of. The hope that they need being offered informed and useful resources, helpful networks, healthy partnerships, choices, and validation. And again, this is not about us changing the family, but rather changing us and how we provide a family-centered approach. That being said, be aware of your role and professional boundaries. We hope you don't walk away feeling like you need to be a grief counselor. We do ask you to be better informed. And if you follow our takeaways above, that is what we consider our appropriate role as family engagement coordinators, family leaders. Referring a family member for counseling may be appropriate, or pointing out particular resources that exist, but a reminder that what you carry on your shoulders needs boundaries, and your self-care is as important as the support you provide others. On behalf of Megan, Molly, and myself, we want to circle back to what we know. Our family's love for their child and the impact their child makes in their lives creates a better world. We just want to acknowledge their journey of grief to continue to strengthen the family's ability to lead. And we so appreciate your desire to learn and take the risk to be a part of this conversation. So we have breakout groups that we'll go to and questions that will help guide. I say this, we hope that This has caused you to pause and reflect on how this may impact your thinking as you've listened to us. We also know there may have been triggers for you personally. Just give yourself a minute to come back to today, where you are in this moment, safe and with others who have a similar passion as you. And that is to better understand yourself and the role that you serve in supporting families. This role, we hope, will help serve you in your job and in your home and in your community. These breakout rooms will not be recorded. We hope that, please know that it'll be kept confidential. We have compassionate facilitators from our Deafblind Network that'll support you. And we hope you enjoy your time together in the breakout rooms. We won't come back and share out. This is for you. And then the questions also will be posted in the chat. So from now, we will break out into our specific groups. Thank you.